Okay, everyone, welcome back to episode 2 of Pastor to Pastor. Today I have a good friend of mine I've known for many years, Clay Smith. And Clay, you want to tell everybody where you're the pastor and how long you've been in ministry and that kind of thing?
Hey, Charlie. Before I begin about me, I should say I knew Charlie back in the day when he was a ne'er-do-well. So it's really great to see how God's grace can help even people like Charlie Wallace. So
Amen.
you and I known Charlie since college, so that's great. So I grew up in South Carolina. I currently pastor Johnson Ferry Baptist Church, which is in North Atlanta in a community called East Cobb, right here on the east side of Marietta, Georgia, and have been here for under a year. I'm sure we'll get into that, but born and raised South Carolina, born in the Myrtle Beach area, raised pretty much in the Greenville area, and grew up actually with a father who's in the ministry. I would say that my church experience growing up was interesting in the sense of there was probably a lot of cultural Christianity, and the church I grew up in was a good church, good people, very nice people, some great people there. I don't remember a whole lot of focus on Jesus or his mission or the Bible. Now that may have a lot more to do with me than the church. So grew up coming to Christ at the age of 8, though I'd say I did not really mature in my faith until I got to college. I was a fairly immature believer, and then went to the University of South Carolina, where all great godly people go to college.
You grew exponentially in your faith. It's amazing, right, how that works.
Yeah, and we may get into this, but being a Gamecock actually is a great training ground for the pastorate.
Absolutely.
For 2 reasons. One, because of the humility it requires to be a Gamecock fan, and number 2, because you're not distracted in the fall. You can just give yourself to ministry.
And your idols are constantly being torn down.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So the very quick story, thought I was going to do something in politics or law. And so when I graduated South Carolina, my goal was to work in politics for a few years and go to law school. And so I got a job with our lieutenant governor at the time in South Carolina, and did that for about 8 months, and was volunteering. Well, at that time I was walking with the Lord, volunteering with a student ministry on Sunday nights. And God used that volunteer experience to call me into full-time ministry. So never went to law school, quit the political job, got a job as a janitor at a church for 6 months. So my very first church job was as a janitor, and got married, went to seminary, and God's been doing some neat things ever since. I'm just trying to serve him. So it's a very quick, condensed version of my walk with the Lord and my involvement with his church.
Well, I imagine you keep a very clean church then if you were a janitor. I'm sure that you.
It is interesting having been a church janitor and now the senior pastor. They're pretty much the same job. But now what you learn what you learn as a doing the facility stuff. Actually, the reality is that the church had a full-time facilities person who quit fairly abruptly, and I was kind of a Band-Aid until they could find a new one. So I was there for 6 months, and which is comical because I like to work with my hands. I wouldn't say I'm the greatest custodian ever, but learn a lot of things. Like I learned, a lot of people don't know this. When you spill coffee on Sunday morning, it doesn't magically go away. Like someone has to clean that up. Or when you walk into a room in your church and all the chairs are perfectly set up, that doesn't just happen. Somebody has to do that. And so really there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff you learn. And in all honesty, you learn a lot about serving and church and people. And so it was really great looking back.
That's awesome. Listen, those jobs are great for the ministry. I mean, when I was at Southwestern, I set up conference tables. I planted tulips. It's for the trustees to look at, So, it's those jobs are, it's helpful for sure. Absolutely. Awesome. Okay. Well, Clay, because, let's talk a little about this. You entered into a situation where you followed a pastor who was there over 40 years, I guess, or right at it. And a lot of pastors, no matter what the size of the church is, whether it's, 100, 200, or over 3,000 in attendance, a lot of pastors will enter a situation where there's been multiple even or one long-term pastor, and they may not have a transition plan like a lot of the larger ones do. So I think there's some transferable principles there when you follow somebody up. So what would you say to a guy that's getting ready to come in, where there's a guy there 15 years or 20 years or 30 years, anything over 10 years is I consider long term. If you look at the average being 3.5, and what would be maybe some just good leadership lessons that you could give on that kind of situation?
I love how you set that up because it is the reality. People may not walk into this exact situation, but
Yeah,
here's something we all need to remember. We are all interim pastors.
good.
You may be at a church 3 years, you may be at a church 53 years, but you won't be there forever. And
No
by the
problem.
way, it's not your church. It's not the people's church. It's Jesus's church.
Good.
And we need to steward the opportunities that we have in front of us. This was unique in that I followed Bryant Wright, who was the founding pastor of the church. He was the first pastor they called. A lot of young guys may not know this, but 30, 40 years ago, the model was really that sometimes a congregation would start as kind of a mission church, and they would meet for a while and then call a pastor,
Mm,
unlike today where we typically start with a planter or a pastor
yeah.
and then they formulate a church. So Johnson Ferry formed as a congregation from some other sister churches here, and they called Bryant, and so the church met in a doctor's office here in one of the fastest growing communities in the nation at the time, and the
Mm,
church just really blew up, and God did a great thing, and Bryant's a great leader and a good friend, and was here
mm,
for 38 years. But coming into 2018-19, really felt like his time here was done. He did not feel like his ministry was done or that God didn't have another assignment for him. He just really struggled with feeling a sense of vision for Johnson Ferry and where it needed to head. And God just began to confirm in him and his wife, Ann, that their time was coming to a close.
mm,
So, regardless of my role in all that, what I greatly benefited from was a pastor who was very intentional about handing off the baton. And so, if there's anyone here watching that maybe has been in a long term ministry role, and you know that maybe your season is coming to an end based on passion levels or age or whatever else,
yeah.
I would encourage you to be thinking about being intentional with a succession plan. So, Bryant, even 5 or 6 years before they called me or whomever the next pastor was going to be, they began to put a plan in place. They had different, and when I say they, I mean he and the elders. We have elders at our church,
Hmm.
but whoever that might be at your church, maybe a deacon or some volunteer team, a vision team of some kind, or any kind of. It'd be good to have a succession plan, not just in your head, but actually on paper. So for him, they had a plan of if I were getting hit by a bus tomorrow and taken to the Lord, what would we do? And they had a number of scenarios. So they mapped out how they were going to do it, how they're going to go about selecting a team. Were very intentional. So all that to say, I was pastoring a church in a suburb of Charlotte, First Baptist Matthews, for about 5 years, and thought I would be there longer than the 5 years I was there. And it was
Hmm.
great people, love the people of Matthews. But I was contacted from Johnson Ferry and the team they were using, and we just began to pray about the opportunity, and God just confirmed to us that this was his calling. So I came in August of 2019 as the second pastor of Johnson Ferry. So a couple lessons I would say is, as I said, intentionality. I would say that if you are the predecessor, you're the one handing off the baton, you have most of the cards, you have most of the influence.
Hmm.
A church is going to have three different groups as relates to any transition. You have the outgoing pastor, you have the incoming pastor, and you have the congregation. And all three have to play a role in the succession. And all three matter, and all three are important that God uses. But I would say the most influential person in that whole conversation is the outgoing pastor. Think about it like this. All right, if we use the idea of passing a baton, think about a relay race. Let's say that the runner's coming, he's got a baton. He could do a couple things with that baton. I mean, he could just look at the new runner and just throw it at him and go, well, here you go. almost with some animosity. And we see some pastors doing that. It's kind of
Mm.
like, well, I didn't want to leave, or I'm not ready to retire, but I guess I got to, or I guess, let this new guy have it. And there's
Yeah.
actually a lot of that happens.
Mm.
Um, Another approach would be where a pastor runs or a runner runs and he gets to the next runner and he just lays down the baton gently with the idea, well, my time came to a close. You have fun. God bless you. Hope it goes well. And
Mm.
that's not always bad. The idea is my time's coming to a close. I don't want to intervene in what you feel led to do. So you take it from here.
Yeah.
What I love that we did was there was a very intentional handoff so that they had a plan in place. So he's running, then I enter into the picture. We have a bit of an overlap season, and
Mm.
then he drops off and I keep running, and which is very intentional in that way. And I could
Yeah.
talk about that for hours, but that meant the world. And so Brian and I had about a 3-month overlap period, and we marked out everything we were going to do in those 3 months. So we divided the sermons. I'd preach half, he'd preach half. We talked through all the meetings. He would lead the deacons and the elders and the staff meeting up to this date, and then I would lead them at this date while he was still here.
Wow.
We even talked about, as pastors, we send letters to people who have either lost someone, or we send letters to people who have had newborn babies. We even decided up until his final day, he would send all the bereavement letters to people who had died, since he had pastored these people. And
Yeah.
I would send all the letters to the newborn baby families, as I would be pastoring them in the coming days. So we
Yeah.
just tried to think of every single detail. We met weekly, talked weekly, lots of communication. So intentionality, lots of communication, being very thorough, getting rid of any assumptions that we can.
Yeah.
And the last thing, I could talk about this forever, and I'll stop talking here, but it is very important as an incoming pastor that you see it as one of your primary goals to help him finish well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes through honoring him, not only
Mm-hmm.
privately and praying for him, but also publicly praising him. It's very important for your church to see that you guys get along. And one of the
Yeah.
things that our church commented on several times is just how natural it all felt, and what a joy it was to see how Bryant and I got along. Because, you have two alpha males who, are very ambitious and want to do great things for God. And let's be honest, sometimes our egos can get ahead of us
Yeah.
and make that very difficult. But we really tried just to be humble, honor one another, and that really helped us to do that well. So now I'm 10 months into first year. We have this little thing called a pandemic going on, so that's been interesting, but
Wow.
it's been great.
That's great. Yeah. If they told you that you would have a pandemic in the first year, maybe, I don't know, right? Would you have taken it? This is why God doesn't tell us what we have up ahead for us.
Well, I am really regretting sleeping through that pandemic class in seminary when they gave you all the ways to lead through this thing, because I must have missed it. And
I
so,
know, right?
like most pastors, I'm just trying to figure out day by day how to
Yeah.
get through the next week.
That's one thing that I think in my church, and then some other churches people I've talked to, is the leadership has been very understanding. It's almost like they appreciate anything you do, looking forward to it, and which is, well, I mean, I'm still going to, continue to lead and all that, but they know how difficult it is. And it was nice for a month or so, even in the church world, where there was really no petty things to deal with. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There was no, there was just, it was real issues, and we're obviously coming out of that now. You can see a little bit of that in the world. And so.
Well, I do think people, let's get leadership lessons in that. A couple things. One, people thrive with clarity. They don't expect you to be able to predict the future, or to be an epidemiologist to know everything about the virus, but they do want you to be clear. And I think people thrive with a plan. So I think it's important that pastors do have a plan that they have articulated to their church. It doesn't mean the plan won't change. It doesn't mean that the future. But I think the fact that you have thought thoroughly to say, here's where we are headed. I think you make a major mistake when you're thinking, I don't fully know all the details, so I don't want to articulate a plan to our people. And all that does is create a vacuum and confusion. So people want a plan, and you can couch it in, this could change. We're going to need
Yeah.
flexibility. We're going to need patience, but they do need a plan. And so I think leaders throughout this thing have had to have a plan throughout. And that's what we tried to do. I think I've tried to encourage our team to not think about the things they can't do, but to think about the things that they can do.
Yeah.
And it's been really neat to see how ministry is taking place in a different way,
Yeah.
but an effective way. And also the gift of this pandemic is, I believe, the chance to hit pause, to hit reset, to think, are we really effective at what God has called us to do as his church in the Great Commission? And the wonderful gift of a crisis makes what is ultimately most important. It makes that very clear, very fast. And
Awesome.
so we have to lead, towards that end. But it's been great. Charlie, it's interesting. Even last week, I don't know how you or other churches do kind of your membership, but we have a class you go through. We call it Discover Johnson Ferry. And so we offered a virtual one, over Zoom.
Oh yeah.
Last Sunday, and had a great attendance that came, and it's neat to see the people that God's sending our way. But this is what was interesting to me. 3 of the families who are joining our church have never actually been on the campus of Johnson Ferry.
Wow. They just watched it.
Well, and we told them and asked them, are you sure? I mean, do you want to wait until things, you can come and be a part? And
Yeah.
they just said, well, from what we've seen and what we've read and heard and all, we're in, we're ready to go. And so it's a different ministry, but God's doing some neat things. I'm sure he's doing things like that at your church as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, what if you come into the sanctuary and it has a weird smell to it, right?
That's right. Well, now it's just your sanctuary is your den, I guess. So if there's a weird smell, it's your fault.
It is yours. That's right. I'll talk a little bit about similarities between pastoring large churches and small churches. I remember when I was on staff at a larger church and God called me to preach, I was going from there to a small church. And, I was the only full-time staff. I had a part-time secretary, part-time youth guy. That was it. And one of my mentors told me, he said, I couldn't pastor that church. And he was at a larger church. He said, this is going to be one of the hardest sized churches to pastor. And once I got there, I realized, okay, I know what he means. And I've heard other people say throughout the years, well, it's so easy to pastor a large church, and, they don't have a lot of the same issues they don't have to deal with, senior adult Betty.
Oh yeah, it's easy, man. I mean, that's not, you just sit around and play golf and watch TV. It's awesome.
But but here's what you hear, you don't have to, senior adult Betty didn't get on me. They can just give that to somebody else and all that. So we know that's not true. So now there might be some really large ministries and maybe some non-denominational churches where the pastor is a speaker and maybe there's not a lot of people he deals with, but your church is in that way. And then a lot of Southern Baptist churches aren't that way. They're large. And so give me a little bit for people who may think the grass is greener, some similarities between pastoring a small church and then a really large church.
I remember at my former church, every church you have people who you don't always click with for whatever reason. Doesn't mean they're not good, godly people, but you may see differently on things. And I remember a person at a former church that this person and I didn't always see eye to eye on things. And as I was leaving to come here to Atlanta, I remember mentioning to someone else at the church, well, at least that person and I won't have to deal with each other anymore.
You've been there.
And the guy said, well, yes and no. The only difference is now you'll have 10 of those people, And I think you need to realize that with greater, bigger platform comes more responsibility and more challenges. I mean, quite honestly, there is a bit of a misnomer. You look at the Instagram accounts and the web pages and you just think, well, this person must just live a cushy life. But the reality is that the bigger the platform, the bigger the pressure. And I think that's why you see just how many pastors, particularly of large churches, have kind of crumbled morally in the last couple of years. And so it's just imperative that you stay close to the Lord and that you make sure you're ministering out of a healthy place.
That's good.
I do think a couple things though. I do think you pastor a church differently with different sizes. I don't think you ever get to where you stop pastoring, but you do pastor in a different way. I mean, 1 Peter 5 says
Yeah.
to shepherd the flock among you. It never says how big the flock needs to be. I mean, whether it's 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people. The church I grew up in had probably 500 people, which
Yeah.
I thought was the biggest church on the planet.
Yeah.
When I went to seminary, I was an intern at Prestonwood Baptist Church, which had a membership then of about 30,000. And what I realized pretty early on is these churches are different in a way, but ultimately they're made up of people, and so you have the same challenges. They just look different. I do think the larger the church is, the more you move from a generalist to a specialist. And you know how it is. The smaller the church you are, you're just wearing more hats, more things you have to. It's not more work per se. It's just you're involved in more pieces of the pie. And I think the larger the church, the more you have to figure out. I mean, you're still involved. I mean, I think about just day-to-day stuff here. There are sometimes I'm very down in the weeds about some very particular things.
Yeah.
And then you have to have the ability to zoom back out to 30,000 feet to look at the big picture. But you have to know, in my role here, what are the 2 or 3 things that I am mostly responsible for?
Yeah.
And so for me here, that I think is certainly the pulpit in terms of our preaching and teaching ministry. That's obviously a huge part of what we do. I think just overall vision, where's the church headed? I'm not the only one that's involved in that process, but where's our church headed?
Yeah.
Towards our mission. And I think, thirdly, just the leadership, particularly of the staff. I don't think that if you want to define pastoring as being intimately involved in relationships with all of the people of your church, there's no way that I can do that in this church. I don't think there's any way you can do that of any church over about 50 people.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
So I think my goal is not to pastor everyone in the sense of to know everyone's issues in life and details and all that, but it is my job to make sure that everyone is getting pastored. And so that involves me leading our staff well. That involves me equipping our lay people to do ministry well. It includes us trying to do what we can to make sure people aren't falling through the cracks. They're getting involved. They're using their gifts. They're equipped in the things of the Lord and deployed and sent into the mission field for Christ. So I don't know if that answers the question, but in some ways it's different, and in some ways it's not. I mean, for instance, there are some unique pressures here that I did not have in my last pastorate. There's one of the things that is often not talked about too, really in general. One is just there's a pace of ministry. The larger the church, just the pace of what you're dealing with on a day-by-day basis is really overwhelming. I mean, I come to the office, and most days you blink, the day is over, and you have about 15 things that you didn't get to. And I've noticed that more here than at smaller churches, just the amount of stuff. And number two, for your family, that fishbowl gets bigger the larger the church that you're in. And so, again, I know that that's an issue for every size church.
Yeah.
But the bigger the church, the bigger the pressure, and in some ways, the bigger the influence that you have to steward one way or the other.
That's good. I think one of the issues that people will talk about a lot of times with that is, well, listen, Clay's got all this staff and he can just make them do whatever. If you don't like him, he can get rid of them. He doesn't have to work with all these volunteers that I have to work with, So differentiate a little bit about leading staff, and you still, as you mentioned, lead volunteers and how, there are people who don't have a lot of staff. So give us some advice about leading volunteers, because your majority of your pastors are going to be doing that. I can't fire this volunteer. Well, technically, you might be able to.
Well, it is different. I will say it's different. I actually said that one time to a pastor I work for. So my quick version ministry trajectory. So for 10 years, I served on the staff of 2 different larger churches in South Carolina as a missions pastor, as an evangelism pastor. I did groups and adult ministry and some other things for those 2 different churches. And I remember actually saying to the senior pastor in a meeting, something like that. Well, you don't, and I'm probably like 25 at the time, you don't understand the pressures of recruiting volunteers. And I'm glad he didn't slap me and throw me out of the room, right? Which is probably what he should have done.
Yeah.
He just kind of looked and laughed And and it's interesting now, I guess 15, 16 years later, I'm thinking, Clay, why would you say something so dumb as that?
Good.
Uh, and with that being said, I do think it's different in the sense of, with staff, you do have the principle of the paycheck, in
Yeah.
the sense of you have leverage in a way to say, we're paying you to do something that we're not expecting laymen necessarily to do.
Yeah.
And there is a higher level of accountability, responsibility that comes with that. And I would say that's different.
Yeah.
But the same leadership principles apply to even leading volunteers, in the sense of, I think the big mistake we make with volunteers is that we set the bar way too low
Hmm.
on what we ask them to do. And I don't mean giving them more work than they can
Yeah.
handle, but we make a mistake of not connecting them to the larger vision of the church, to say, hey, when you serve, rocking babies in the nursery,
Hmm.
thank you, because here's how it's helping lives to be changed. Here's how it's helping us reach and disciple people for Jesus Christ. When you're an usher at the door, hey, this is a big deal, because this is how it helps in that way. When you come up on Wednesday night and you help, fix the dinner as people come to eat on Wednesday night, or whatever it looks like I think what you have to do as the leader is really help connect the dots with your people, and
Awesome.
to help them see bigger than just the task, the
Yeah.
purpose and the vision and the mission of why you do, what you do, and to thank them. It's amazing how many times we as leaders take them for granted and just don't thank and celebrate how God's people are working. I mean, I'm a big believer in Ephesians 4. It says our primary task is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. I think we get that backwards, and I've noticed, particularly in smaller churches, where this gets backwards a lot of times, where they think, well, no, we hired the pastor to do
Yeah.
ministry.
Oh yeah.
Where Ephesians 4 says, no, actually, the pastor is there to equip you
That's right.
to do ministry. So, case in point, this past Sunday was talking briefly about evangelism, reaching people for Christ, and I told our church, I am not our evangelism strategy. That doesn't mean that I don't need to do my part in sharing the gospel with unbelievers, but our evangelism strategy is not, hey, invite your friends to come hear the pro, I'll share the gospel, and we'll see lives change. No. My job is to equip you as the church. You go to your workplace, you go to your coffee shops, you go to your ball fields, you go to your hunting club, you go to wherever you go, and you share the gospel. Now, it's my job to make sure you're getting equipped, and so we're going to give training opportunities and different ways to do that. But we just have to think like that. I think the greatest thing you do as a pastor, if there's a metaphor, I mean, the shepherd obviously is the biblical metaphor or analogy of leadership, and that's such a key one. We don't want to lose that.
Yeah.
If I could think of a more modern one, it would not be like CEO or something, but I think like a coach is a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, the coach of a football team, it's his job to get his players ready. And so when Saturday or Sunday comes, the coach doesn't get on the field. He's not throwing the ball. He's not handing it off, but he is making sure that all the players are doing that to the best of their ability. And so my success, if you want to say it that way, I know it's ultimately about God, but my success is found through how our players are playing the game on the field. And to me, that's a completely different mindset than, well, no, I'm the quarterback.
Yeah.
You hired me to throw the ball.
Right.
You hired me to throw, you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
That's good. Oh yeah, absolutely. No. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it's hard. The shepherd obviously is the biblical model, but I mean, it's been many years since I've had sheep. So I mean, I've never actually truly watched sheep on it. So I can imagine what it would be like.
Yeah.
But we can relate to coach. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying it's like that, because in many ways, if you look at a successful football program, I see a lot of similarities on staff and the head coach. You can't be calling the plays, and if they do, they're sacrificing something else, and and things like that. And so
and I think it's maybe, I don't know, just the bigger the organization, the more you have to think strategically like that. So
that's good. Awesome. So y'all have open back up live, or is that next week?
So we came up, probably like your church or other
Yeah.
churches, we came up with what we are calling steps, and that was intentional. We didn't use the word phase. We just didn't want to confuse what we were doing with the state of Georgia's phases
Oh yeah.
entry, but
That's
we do
good.
have steps. And so we are moving now from what we're calling step 2 to step 3. So uh, on June the 7th, we will begin step 3, which for us means regathering in-person corporate worship.
Yeah.
But like most churches, there will be a bit of it's going to be a different experience, just in the sense of we're
Yeah.
doing fewer services than we were doing, more time in between for cleaning.
Yeah.
We're not requiring, but we are recommending people wear masks. We won't have childcare or our other on-campus Bible studies in small groups.
Yeah.
So, but it is a step in the right direction, and we're excited. We did a practice run last Sunday. Had some of our key volunteers, deacons, some others that came up and worshiped with us. And then we did a training afterward and had a
Yeah.
prayer time. And it was just, we're excited just to be back in the building. And I know that the church isn't limited to a building on Sunday morning, but still to gather
Yeah.
publicly is a big deal. And we're really excited about that happening on June the 7th. And I'm sure, like most churches, we'll look at it week to week, and we'll try to accelerate our timeline as best as it seems wise to do so. And would love to think that if the virus numbers stay where they are and get better, and if the confidence factor of our people gets higher, that we'll see more and more people coming over the next weeks and months, and we're really looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, we started on the 17th with just worship for 3 weeks of what we did, and we're moving into childcare and things like that in Sunday school this week. But the first week
Okay.
we opened, we had about 45% total what we normally run. So, and I talked to another person had about the same. So that might be something to shoot for. It seems like to me. And then it's been
I think I've had in
50.
my mind maybe 30%.
Yeah, that would not be a bad
And
expectation.
it's not just a fear factor you're overcoming. There is some of that, but there's also a hassle factor. You got to get here earlier. For us,
Yeah.
I know every church is different. We do 2 different venues, 2 different
Mhm.
types of services, same sermon, message, all that, but 2 different styles and all that. And so we have different parking lots for the 2 different rooms, and we have a way you have to, drive on the campus, drive off the campus.
Yeah.
Certain halls you can go into, halls you can't go into. Even when the service is over, you have to dismiss, probably like you do in an orderly way. And
That's right.
let's be honest. I mean, that as much as people want to gather together, they're thinking, I don't know if I want to go through all that. And if it's good online, I'll just keep watching it. But
Yeah, I would say to pastors out there who haven't started back, and as you do, maybe some people who don't come back right away or maybe for a while, and make sure you outreach to those people, because you get in the habit. And I went 8 weeks without speaking to anybody other than a camera. And so I had to go on YouTube and Google how to preach and watch some YouTube videos. And no, I literally went into the sanctuary the Saturday before and just stood behind the pulpit there and looked around and just kind of like talked through it and just said, I think, just kind of like, and it was kind of emotional for me because I hadn't done it for 2 months, and just really spent a long time praying. And there was a great, even though it was, half full or less than that, there was a great spirit of people who hadn't been in worship, and they were ready to worship Jesus. We had people from other churches who came just because their church hadn't opened up yet. And so it's a fun celebratory time. It'll be strange. It'll be unique.
Yeah, it was emotional just in kind of our dry run the other day. It was like you've experienced, and we'll go through the same thing. And I think also the challenges like you're having to do, you're speaking to 2 groups now. I mean, in the sense of you got the people live, but at least for the first couple of weeks, and who knows, maybe even for months, you got more eyes on you through the camera than you do even in the room. And so I think as a communicator, as a preacher, as a worship leader, whomever is on the stage, you have to both address the people in the room and address the people behind the camera. And that's just something most of us were not trained to do. So we've got to find a way to get good at that, because you're going to live in both of those worlds for probably, I would say, a while. I mean, I don't see normalcy. I've joked about kind of BC and AD. I tell our staff, that BC was before coronavirus, AD is after distancing, and think about time to being divided. BC, I don't know when that world's coming back, or if it,
Uh,
even if it is in the same way for a
I don't
while.
know.
I'm not saying I want that to be the case.
Yeah.
I think that's reality.
I think the reality is it's going to take a while for the crowds to get back the way they were. It might be the fall, but it might be next year. And who knows how that'll happen. And
Yeah.
there's no way to know. And we can all make kind of predictions and stuff. But, once college football season starts, and everybody's in the stands wearing masks.
Yeah.
I think they'll, what happened here?
Yeah.
My, there we go. Anyhow, sorry, something popped up on here.
Yeah.
Well, Clay, anything you want to give just as we end? And I need just last minute advice to pastors that are maybe just in a state where they're struggling right now, where maybe you have a guy that is maybe enjoyed his COVID break too much, and now he's coming back in, and he's like, this is a tough season for me, because pastors go through those from time to time. Any encouragement?
I've had a roller coaster of emotions through this thing. You should think of it like the grief cycle when someone loses a loved one or something else.
Yeah.
You do go through those various stages of denial, anger, bargaining, mourning, acceptance, all those things. I think that's true in this as well. I mean, I remember a few weeks ago just hitting a low point and just being frustrated and overwhelmed with the bad news in the world, and even to the point where you kind of don't even want to come do your job, and kind of difficult to deal with. And I would say just giving that to the Lord and trusting Him, and kind of getting over your little pity party, and just be reminded that God is not stressed out about the coronavirus. He's not anxious. He's not pacing around heaven wondering what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
I think we need to just realize that I don't think we have any definitive proof that God is causing the coronavirus, but I think we can at least say that He's allowing it. And we need to say that God is going to use it. And so I believe that on the other side of this thing is going to be, or will be, great things that will happen for the Lord. People coming to Christ.
That's
people
right.
realizing that the false idols of their money and career and entertainment and other things cannot satisfy in the way they thought they would. And so I really see that these are great days for the church. I mean, the darker it gets out there, the brighter the light shines, and we need to be that light of Christ. So I would just say keep your chin up, and just realize that God is at work. I also just want to encourage you to have great friends. I mean, I appreciate my friendship with Charlie, and so neat to see kind of how God's working in your life as well. But even throughout this whole coronavirus, I mean, I've had several pastors that we talk weekly, sometimes just joking around about life or movies or church. And a lot of times we're exchanging ideas about, hey, what are you guys doing? And what's your strategy, and how are you handling this? And and I can't tell you just how valuable that's been. So I would just say, don't do this alone. You don't need to do it alone. Find pastors in your area. They don't even have to be in your area, but just find pastors around the country, be encouraged by. You don't have to be a hero. Jesus is the hero. But you can do this. We're going to get through it. And I think we got great days to come.
Good. Hey, Clay, enjoy talking with you. We appreciate
Charlie, thanks for having me. It's always a blessing, and appreciate you.
Thank you.